Hi, I'm Joe Spina. Welcome to the Joe Show. A little stream of consciousness. Way back when, Senator from Arkansas, otherwise known as Tom Cotton, said that the virus that was plaguing a pandemic that was plaguing the United States and the world originated in a lab in Wuhan, China. Oh, no, impossible. It's conspiracy theories. No. Came out of nature. No, please, no. None of that. What kind of? So said Donald Trump. So said Mike Pompeo. Oh, no. And the deification of Dr. Fauci began. I was awaiting, I'm wondering why he never made it to the Vatican. I assumed that was going to take place and he'd go to the Vatican and Pope Francis would bestow upon him sainthood. The media was in love with him. Absolutely. I mean, this was the authority. Follow the science, my friend, follow the science. And we listened to Dr. Fauci for an entire year and a half. And then the emails. Ouch. Thousands of emails between Dr. Fauci, colleagues, have surfaced under the Freedom of Information Act. And some of the things that they've able to determine was that duplicity, obfuscation, outright lies to the American people were the norm. And a lot of people died. The economy got wrecked. Life is on the fast lane was no longer that fast or that enjoyable. Not only in the United States, but in the world. And China, who are accountable or responsible for it all, was let off the hook pretty much. Some of the things that have been uncovered. One is that Fauci had recommended that religious services be canceled. But at the same time, he approved campaign rallies. I wonder why. And cruise ships. Senator Paul summed it all up. He said, told you that this guy was a charlatan. You didn't want to listen. This is the one that really got me. It's reported that Fauci said in an email that drugstore masks aren't really effective. And yet we had this mania about mask wearing. I did an entire Zoom on what the Institute of Physics, American Institute of Physics, did exhaustive studies on the efficacy of masks, and their conclusion was that they were useless. And I said so, and of course, nobody wanted to listen to that. In fact, I used to be amused when I'd see someone driving in their car with the window up, no one in the car wearing a mask. And I was wondering, what is that all about? So not only did he know that masks weren't effective, he turned around and touted wearing multiple masks. And you can imagine how harmful that might be to a young kid who has asthma or whatever, any respiratory ailment. Wearing a mask doesn't help, that's for sure. And yet that was touted. I mean, if Joe Biden wore a bigger mask, all he did was wear masks, and all he says, mask, we're driving us crazy with this mask. And we come to find out they weren't effective in the first place. So that's part one. Part two, stream of consciousness. The Federal Reserve Bank system, or the Federal Reserve, they came into being about World War I under Woodrow Wilson. And in effect, what they do is they set monetary policy. They're like they're fundamentally a national bank, a quasi governmental agency. The board of directors, the head of the Federal Reserve is appointed by the President of the United States, and on it goes. Now, I can tell you who wasn't too fond of the national bank, and that was Andrew Jackson, who had went to war with Nicholas Biddle, who was a proponent of the national bank. And those were big issues during that era. historical era. So, but in I believe it was 1919, in around that time, Federal Reserve banking system was instituted in the United States, and they're the ones that pretty much can affect economic policy in the United States of well-being. They determine the interest rate, and right now it's so low, and that helps to ward off inflation, allegedly, supposedly. Anyways, the Federal Reserve, not Joe Spina, the Federal Reserve sees widespread supply chain disruptions. That's number one. Translated, that simply means when you go to the grocery store, there's nothing on the shelf. That's what that means. They also see labor shortages. Wonderful. We know that already. You know why? Because the government is subsidizing people not to go to work. So why work? I mean, why would you go to work if you're making less money working than you're making watching television at home? You can watch The View and The Five and be indoctrinated. I mean, that's even better. And that's what's happening. So if you wonder why, it's because of the subsidizing of folks not to work. And that's, by the way, a massive transfer of wealth. It goes from a productive sector to a non-productive. So we're paying people not to produce. Now that's an insanity in itself. The other thing that the Federal Reserve is highly, highly suspect of and worrisome is the rising prices. No kidding. I mean, any of you have gone to fill up your gas tank, say, what's this? I mean, we're talking about significant increase in gasoline, which in effect is going to drive up the cost of goods and services because everything's dependent upon transportation. You can't move merchandise and product from one place to another unless it's in a vehicle. That vehicle consumes gas. The gas goes up, that means the cost goes up. And by the way, all you have to do is listen to the radio here and there, and they're consistently advertising for truck drivers. They can't even get truck drivers. And they're actually paying people to become truck drivers. They're giving $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 as a, would you mind being a truck driver? So if that's the case, if you have to pay truck drivers more money, supply and demand, Adam Smith, what happens to the cost of goods and services as you're moving them? They go up. And who is getting nailed to the cross on that one? Nobody else but the consumer, you and I, which is effectively a tax. So any of this stuff that you hear about, oh, we're not going to tax anybody making less than $400,000. Oh, really? Well, inflation, the most insidious of all taxes, is upon us. And that's directly related to the policies of the Build Back Better Biden plan. Speaking of which, how does anybody want to talk about Build Back Better? The country was doing quite well. It didn't have to be Build Back Better under the Trump administration. Unemployment rate was at an all-time low. Minority employment was at the all-time high. I mean, things were rocking and rolling like no tomorrow. What was there to build? It was fine. What we should have done is left things alone and built on top of the foundation that Trump built rather than tearing it down. For example, the wall. Okay? He was building a wall. What happened to our immigration problem, illegal immigration? It dissipated. Illegal drugs weren't coming into the country, without borders, without anybody interdicting them. So now what we have is we have open borders. We have floods of people flocking into the United States illegally from who knows where. They actually go from countries in Asia and Africa and the Middle East or wherever. They fly into Caracas or they fly into Lima, Peru or wherever, and from there into Mexico City, and then they cross the border. I mean, this is not just Central Americans coming into this country illegally. They're coming from all over the world, of which some of them aren't necessarily friends of ours. But if you listen to Joe Biden, oh, no, they're not a threat to our national security. The number one threat, don't you ever forget this, American people, are those damn white supremacists. Forget the jihadists. It's the white supremacists. They're the ones they're the bad guys. They're a national threat. Now, here's the reality. 62 cases of people being killed by white supremacists, allegedly white supremacists, over a 5-year period of time, which comes to about 16 a year. Meanwhile, in Chicago, over 700 were killed by not white supremacists, I'll tell you that right now. So, I mean, this stuff it's an insanity, and people listen to it, and the press never questions. How about this one? Google. Google. You know, the masters of the universe. Talk about oligarchs. They have a diversity chief. And that diversity chief, his name is Camus Bob. Well, Camus Bob, you know, diversity chief is supposed to make sure that everything is copacetic. You know, you have X amount of men, women, people of color, people of sexual preference, and all that type of stuff. You know, everybody is equity. That's the thing, equity. They call it equity. Well, let me ask you how equitable this is. And his quote got nothing to do with me. His quote: Jews. You know those people, the Jews, Star of David? Yeah, Jews. Jews have an insatiable appetite for war and killing. Quote unquote. Jews have an insatiable appetite for war and killing. How's that for a statement? That's the head of diversity from Google. Instead of being vilified all over the place, the press barely mentioned it. Here's another one that caught my eye. Try this one out for size. Mueller, however you pronounce it, from the infamous Mueller investigation, 4-year witch hunt of Donald Trump for collusion with Russia. And let me get into that for 1 second. You know, we hear about collusion that Trump and Putin were buddy-buddy, or Putin had something on Trump, and on it goes. Now let's talk about what really happened. Under the Obama administration, right off the get-go, Hillary Clinton, Secretary of State, with a big smile on her face and a button, pressing a button with the foreign minister of Russia, in which they said they're going to have a reset with Russia. Oh, we're going to get along with Russia. That was the Obama administration. At the same time, Hillary, Secretary of State, signed off of what they call the Uranium One deal. Now, Uranium One's fascinating. It didn't get a lot of press, but think about this. Under the Uranium One deal, Putin, Russia, was able to obtain 20% of the United States uranium reserves. Now, get this. Our adversary, our alleged existential threat, we end up giving them a piece, 20% of our uranium reserve supply. Now, I don't want to sound, you know, conspiratorial. I don't want people labeling me a conspiracy theorist and, you know, oh my God, and being vilified. But let's put 2 and 2 together. Uranium, you can do 2 things with it. You can make nuclear plants to generate electricity and energy, which is a good idea and a good end, or you can make bombs. Now, what do you think the Russians were going to do with the uranium? Do you think they were going to make nuclear plants, or do you think they were going to make bombs? Fast forward. The Crimea, which is a peninsula going into the Black Sea, it's a warm water port that Russia has in Soviet Union, and Russia throughout history has salivated over, was invaded and annexed by Putin during the Obama administration. Was anything done? Did Secretary Kerry or Clinton or Obama or Vice President Biden, did they scream and yell about it? No, not at all. Did nothing. And they managed to say a couple of harsh words, but that was the end of it. Nothing happened. And the Crimea now became annexed away from the Ukraine, actually, and became part of Putin's geopolitical strategy. And Russian troops were banging away at the Ukraine. And the Ukraine is seeking military assistance from the United States in the form of defensive weaponry, namely the Javelin system, where the Javelins are rockets, propelled rockets to stop tanks. There's tank killers. So they kept pleading for those, and Obama obliged by sending them blankets. You know who sent them the Javelin missiles to fight off the Russian tanks, by the way? Happened to be a guy named Donald Trump. He's the one that sent them the Javelins. And if you remember correctly, President Obama assigned Joe Biden for the task. He was tasked to represent the United States in dealings with the Ukraine. And somehow or another, his son, Hunter, became, on the board of directors of one of their, if not the largest energy company in the Ukraine, at the tune of about $83,000 a month. Not too bad. It's a pretty good month's pay, with no background whatsoever. And no one said a word about that. That was perfectly okay. Still to this day, that hasn't come forward. And here's the other best part about it, is that we got all upset and we impeached the president, who made a phone call congratulating the reform president who defeated the corrupt cadre of individuals who had been running the Ukraine up to that point in time. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. Not only that, since World War II, or the termination of World War II, the end of World War II, it's just a close of an act, because the war was continued, otherwise known as the Cold War. In order to protect Western Europe from Soviet aggression, we have, for the past, or since the end of World War II, had in place in Poland strategic missiles, so that if tanks started rolling in from Moscow, that they could be stopped at the gate by these missiles. Who do you think pulled those missiles out of Poland for the defense of NATO? It wasn't Trump, it was Obama. Now let's get to the Keystone, or not the Keystone, the pipeline. Russia is loaded with petroleum. Folks don't realize that. Natural gas and all types of energy. And you know what is a consumer of that? Germany, particularly West Germany. They need, in order for you and I to end up with BMWs, which I can't afford, or Mercedes, or products from Germany, they need fuel, they need power, they need fossil fuels, by the way. That's what they operate from. And they get them from Russia through a pipeline. Russia wants to build their Keystone pipeline across into Western Europe. You don't put the screws to that more than anybody else? Donald Trump. By making the United States energy independent, that really affected negatively the economy of Russia, which is highly dependent upon the cost and their ability to sell petroleum, oil, natural gas, and the rest, particularly to Europe. And Trump made an issue to the Europeans. Why are you buying from Russia instead of buying from us? We have a glut of natural gas, and we put those, and that would have stimulated eastern port cities like Boston, Baltimore, and on it goes, New York, etc., because these ships could send, the container ships could send the natural gas over by ship to Europe for their consumption. Now, Trump facilitated all that type of stuff. And the ones who put the screws to it, that held back on it, was Biden, Obama. But do you have any journalists who are honest enough to write such stories and comparatives? Let's talk about reality. Let's not talk about what you like to be. Just because you don't like someone's personality doesn't mean that person isn't a good leader. I mean, lo and behold, I don't think that, Donald Trump, I don't look at his personality, I look at what he did. There are a lot of nice people that do a lot of bad things, not realizing it because, they're just inept. Nice people can be incompetent. Now to move on from there, about reality and the rest of it. So Mueller, where I began before I went on my rant, is hired, and I get this one, is hired to teach a course at the University of Virginia Law School, and the course is about his investigation. How objective do you think that's going to be? I mean, is that indoctrination or education? And preceding that, this goes to show the state of American education. Preceding that, Tulane University in New Orleans has hired Hunter Biden to teach a course on family affairs or something to that effect. I mean, that's a classic in itself. Meanwhile, Princeton decided in the name of systemic racism that anybody who wants to study the classics, otherwise known as Western civilization, no longer have to take or learn Latin or Greek. That requirement has been dropped. At the same time, a few years earlier, Harvard, one of our prestigious universities, required, or the requirement that their music majors take courses in what they call musical theory. And musical theory is akin to, or musical theory is to music as grammar and vocabulary is to language. Well, that requirement was dropped. Meanwhile, as I stated in an earlier Zoom, China is picked up on Latin and Greek and classical studies. 11 of the universities currently are highly invested in teaching both, and they have plans to have 20 more universities staffed with Latin and Greek learning in the classics. They're adopting Western civilization big time as we're, deconstructing it as to the most classical or the most Western of all art forms of Western civilization, which is classical music. I mean, as I'm doing this Zoom, there are 100 Chinese students banging away at the piano, learning how to play classical music, and the violin and the cello and all the instruments of an orchestra. Not only in China, by the way, in Japan and South Korea. It's amazing to me that the Orient, which is hardly white Caucasian or white supremacists, how they have adopted all of the Western style structures and institutions, and they celebrate them. Classical music, classical studies, the way they dress. I mean, how many Chinese people do you see walking around looking like mandarins? I mean, give me a break. I mean, I was amused. I went to my granddaughter's graduation the other day, and I saw all these folks in caps and gowns. And I said, gee, I thought about that. I've had a few occasions with caps and gowns. Why do we wear caps and gowns? I mean, it's a tradition, right? Tradition from where? From the university systems of Western civilization. People of all different types of persuasions and colors, when they graduate, wear caps and gowns. And if the ceremony is a ceremony that was perfected and put together and traditional from, University of Krakow or University of Heidelberg or whatever, the European universities. I mean, fundamentally, and that's what it is. And it's for good things. It was a pleasure seeing all of these folks taking pride in their children graduating, and grandchildren and relatives graduating from high school with a diploma. And these folks came from disadvantaged backgrounds from Central America and other parts of the world, in which they didn't have that opportunity. To see that pride, they're giving flowers to their kids and taking pictures. It's a beautiful sight. It's a beautiful sight. And we should be celebrating stuff like that instead of ripping one another apart, which is driving me absolutely bonkers. As we move on, a new memoir has come out in a book, Conspiratorial Theory, by the way, which reveals that Frank Sinatra, good old Mr. Blue Eyes, he never believed that Marilyn Monroe committed suicide. He's absolutely convinced that she was murdered. And if you think about those times, and we haven't done any investigative reporting on it, Marilyn Monroe had some very influential and powerful paramours. Is that a nice way of saying it? The brothers Kennedy being the two foremost ones. And at that time, it wasn't considered kosher for the President of the United States and the Attorney General of the United States to have a Hollywood playmate. And apparently, Sinatra is convinced that somehow or another, it was decided that she had to go. So, just a little tidbit. The way of the world is fascinating. So let me end my little stream of consciousness. Oh, there was one other before I end this thing. It struck me. I was driving around doing who knows what, listening to Joe Biden on the radio. He was in Tulsa, Oklahoma, commemorating, as he should, the 100th anniversary of a race slaughter that took place in, I believe it was Greenwood, Oklahoma, 100 years ago, in which a number of blacks were murdered and executed, or however you want. It was horrible. I mean, it's not something to be proud of as a nation, or as just inhumane, akin to the Holocaust, or what happened in the Ottoman Empire in 1917 with the elimination of the Armenians. That was a Holocaust of its own nation. It's taking place in the Belgian Congo at this time, where one tribe is trying to wipe out another tribe. The Hatfields and McCoys, all of this type of the Crip and the Blood, and on it goes. Mankind, I would hope, will become far more sensitive to. It's beyond hate. It's just simple evil. Evil and cruelty should have no quarters in human society. Unfortunately, it does. What troubled me is when he gave the speech, instead of it being a uniting speech as advertised when he was running for president, he'd be a uniter, not a divider. He was fighting for the heart and soul of the United States, and on and on. I went, this is who we are. If I hear that another time, I'd vomit. Well, he turned around, and his answer to all bad, to evil, cruelty, hate, and the rest of it, was white supremacists. It's the white supremacy that's more insidious, that's more destructive to our national security and everything else than anything else. I mean, more so, he said categorically, more so than jihadists and terrorism or anything else. And what was fascinating about the whole thing, and this is not my idea, I was watching a program last night, Tucker Carlson Tonight, and they ran across some stats that were fascinating. I'd never heard them anywhere. And I'm not going to tell you that I'm going to take them as de facto, but certainly something to be considered and to find out whether, in fact, that's factually accurate, is that if you take a look at violence committed by white supremacists, recorded violence by white supremacists, and that would include in some of these instances where someone has done a mass shooting at a school and something that's attributable to a white supremacist, the number was 64 over a number of years, which averages out to 16 per year. That would be the violence, devastation, death factor of white supremacy in the United States. And the point that Tucker Carlson made was that in the city of Chicago alone, in that same period of time, there were over 800 murders. So, and hardly done by white supremacists. So his point being is that what was President doing? What was he talking about? Why did he do that? I mean, it's more divisive and pitting people one against another. I mean, you can see I'm an old white guy. I think I'm a decent human being. I have my own demons I have to deal with, but one of the things I'm not about to do is get a rope and start lynching people. That's for sure. I have no desire. I think everybody is everybody gets up in the morning trying to have a good day. That's the way I view life. And I'm more concerned about a value system. You work, you love your children, you take care of things, you're kind. Those are the types of virtues, that I was kind of brought up with, and that's about it. So, I mean, do I think I'm superior to anybody? No, I don't think so. I mean, I think, I got my own I got my ups, I got my downs. I'm called human. And if I were perfect, I'd be up in the sky somewhere dictating, but I'm not. And I don't pretend to be. But frankly, I get offended by being, called a white supremacist because I'm white. I never even thought I was white, to be honest with you. I mean, I'm Sicilian, for God's sakes. We're not, with the white guys, we always thought were those Norwegians, the blonde, blue-eyed ones, even though I have greenish eyes, was fairly light complected. But, it's just hilarious how we twist and turn things around. And truth is very hard to come by nowadays. A lot of stuff that's purported to be factual and true is not even close to being either one. No one does a quick analysis of. Trump says a whole bunch of stuff that they claim was falsehoods. I mean, Fauci, now that we got the emails, we know that he was blowing smoke for a year and a half. And let me tell you, the Biden administration with its Build Back Better and the rest of the stuff, there's no crisis on the border. I mean, you want to talk about a big lie? That's the lie of lies, that there's no crisis at the border, that the border's closed and sealed and shut. That's what they're trying to tell you, and people buy into it. I mean, it amazes me. Wake up. Wake up, wake up, wake up. How can you be on the board of directors of an energy company in the Ukraine making $83,000 a month, and that's considered kosher when you have absolutely zero qualifications to be there? And it just happens that the president or the vice president of the United States at that time in charge of Ukrainian relations, who, by the way, by a stroke of the pen, can or cannot pony up $1 billion to that particular country. I mean, if you put all that together, you can drive to a pretty accurate conclusion of why that individual happened to be on the board of directors. It had nothing to do with merit. And that's not nice. And furthermore, you can take a look at the relationship between certain government officials and their allegiances or their preferences for particular countries that aren't necessarily friendly to us. I mean, why would you give Iran 150 billion bucks? I mean, think about that. What is the point of that? Didn't, or is it right now, as I speak, as I'm doing this little thing, doesn't Hunter Biden still have a piece of action in conjunction with the Chinese Communist Party entity, business entity? He has a business relationship with them. Now, does that necessarily mean that something corrupt is taking place? No. But I would think that it's not necessarily kosher either. And it's better that you don't. So I wish the press would be fair about it. What's good for the goose is good for the gander, as they say. The kettle calling the pot black is pretty hypocritical. And we have too much of that. And what I'm afraid of, and what I'm concerned about, I kind of like that phrase about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I think that is probably the greatest human statement by any government entity all time. What is the purpose of government? What is government supposed to do? It's supposed to guarantee that you, me, and everybody has life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's simple. And get out of the way and let us do that. Well, that's not happening when we start pitting people against each other and we start taking away their individuality, their rights, their human liberties, and on it goes. A lot of people use cliches, the focus groups and the rest of it. Come to find out that those focus groups, they're padded too. I mean, polling. I mean, you can twist polls any which way you want. And I'm going to confess something to you. I'm not proud about it, but it's actuality. In another incarnation, another life at another time, many years ago, as I was sitting in a classroom and overseeing an election in a class as to who was going to be the class president or treasurer or all the different offices. And all of a sudden there's a name, and the ones who read the ballots, who made the count slip, and you see the kids would tend to vote for the class clown or something like that, a disruptive one, Fonzarelli, although he wasn't that, he was a sympathetic character. But there's some editing took place, I must say, fraud, the wrong vote count, to guarantee and make sure, here's the nobility, it's how you rationalize it, is that the worthy person became the class president, not the class clown, because the class clown is going to win every time, or mostly. It seems to me that we have started electing a bunch of class clowns. And we got to get to the business of putting responsible, meritorious, accomplished people in positions of power. Some of the folks, I mean, listen to them. Listen to what they have to say. I mean, how they got elected is beyond my belief. But that's the way it is going west. Anyway, have yourself a good one.